I've always felt like I was born with a zoom lens instead of regular eyes. My name is Sara, and in the Army, I'm what they call a geospatial analyst. That's a fancy way of saying I spend 10 hours a day staring at satellite photos, drone feeds, and topographical maps until the contour lines start dancing in my sleep. I can spot a camouflaged sniper nest from 5 miles up or tell you the exact depth of a river just by the color of the silt. But here's the thing, I can navigate a path through a minefield on a screen, but I can't navigate a simple conversation in the hallway without looking like I'm about to pass out. My shyness is like a heavy rucksack I can't ever take off. It's not just that I'm quiet, it's that I'm constantly second-guessing the space I occupy. When I walk into the briefing room, I don't see colleagues. I see a wall of judgment and loud voices. Everyone else in my unit seems to have been born with a built-in megaphone. They tell jokes, they argue, and they command attention just by breathing. I, on the other hand, have perfected the art of becoming part of the furniture. I'm the girl who always has her nose in a map, the one who nods instead of speaking, and the one whose face turns the color of a sunset if someone so much as asks me for the time. This job is a double-edged sword for someone like me. On one hand, the solitude of the lab is heaven. I love the silence of the pixels and the way the land tells me its secrets without expecting me to make small talk. On the other hand, the military is built on communication. If you see something, you're supposed to scream it. But for me, the words often get caught in my throat, strangled by the fear of being wrong or, worse, being looked at. There have been dozens of times when I've noticed a tiny detail, a broken branch in a photo or a strange shadow near a supply route, and I've kept it to myself because the thought of standing up and pointing it out made my stomach do a slow, agonizing flip. Last month, we were deployed to a forward operating base near the Iron Ridge, a jagged range of mountains that looks like the teeth of a giant. The mission was supposed to be a standard reconnaissance in force. My job was to stay back at the base, feed the team coordinates, and watch their icons move across my screen like little green ants. But then, the commander, Colonel Briggs, decided he wanted a ground-eye view of a specific canyon that the satellites couldn't penetrate because of the dense canopy and the morning mist. He looked around the room, his eyes skipping over the loud lieutenants and the eager sergeants, and for some reason, they landed on me. "Specialist, you've been staring at this ridge for 6 weeks," he said, his voice like grinding stones. "You're going with the scout team. I want you to confirm the landing zones and make sure my maps aren't lying to me." I felt the blood drain from my face so fast I thought I might hit the floor. My heart started pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I tried to say that I wasn't field ready, that I was just a map nerd, but all that came out was a faint, pathetic squeak. Briggs didn't even hear me. He was already moving on to the next task. And just like that, I was shoved out of my dark, safe office and into a world of dirt, sweat, and very loud soldiers. The scout team is led by Sergeant Jax, a man who looks like he was carved out of granite and fed on nothing but gravel. He didn't hide his annoyance at having a desk jockey along for the ride. He didn't even look at me when I climbed into the back of the transport. I sat there, clutching my ruggedized tablet to my chest, feeling the stares of the other 5 soldiers. They were all checking their rifles and checking their gear, while I was just trying to remember how to breathe. I wanted to tell them that I knew this terrain better than anyone, that I had memorized every crevice of that canyon, but the iron gate in my throat was locked tight. I was just the quiet girl in the corner, hoping no one would ask me to do anything important. The rhythmic thumping of the helicopter blades felt like a drumbeat of anxiety in my chest. Cold air from the half-open door bit into my face, but I was more distracted by the weight of the team stares. Jax, the sergeant who looked like he'd been carved out of a granite block, sat in the corner cleaning his fingernails with a small knife. The others were busy checking their gear, their movements fluid and confident. Me? I was clutching my tablet like it was a life raft. I wanted to tell them that the eastern ridge of the canyon we were heading toward was much steeper than it looked on the paper maps, but the words were frozen in my throat. The fear of my voice being drowned out by the engine, or worse, being met with Jax's judgmental glare, kept me silent. When we finally touched down, the sudden silence of the mountains hit me like a physical weight. The Iron Ridge was terrifying. Sharp black rocks jutted out from the earth like they were trying to tear the sky open. Jax signaled forward, and the team moved out. I was the tail-end Charlie, the last one in line. Every step I took sent a crunch of gravel echoing through the thin air, and I felt like every enemy for miles was listening to my clumsy footsteps. I opened my tablet. The GPS signal was weak, but it was working. According to my calculations, the path Jax had chosen led straight into a blind spot, a deep crevice that wouldn't be visible from above. A perfect spot for an ambush. I wanted to speak up. I cleared my throat, but the sound was pathetic. Jax was a few paces ahead, and the other soldiers were spread out in a tactical formation. Sergeant Jax. My voice was so thin I barely heard it myself. Jax didn't even turn around. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I thought to myself, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they know what they're doing. You're just a map nerd, Sara, remember that. That familiar self-doubt was trying to lock the door again. I tried one more time, a bit louder, Sergeant Jax. This time he stopped and turned around with an annoyed scowl. The whole team stopped. Jax looked at me with those cold, tired eyes. What is it, specialist? Did you trip on a pebble? Or is your tablet out of batteries? A couple of the guys snickered. I felt my whole body turn hot with shame. My hands started to shake. I held the tablet toward him and stammered, up ahead, there's a gap. It's not on your paper maps. It could be dangerous. We should take the western slope. Jax glanced at the tablet, then at the path ahead, which looked perfectly clear and easy. He let out a mocking laugh. Look, kid, we don't have time to climb rocks because your tablet sees a shadow. We're staying on the path. Just try to keep up and don't fall over your own feet. I felt humiliated. Again. That same old feeling that I was just an extra piece of luggage that happened to know how to read coordinates. I wanted to disappear into the ground, but there was no room for tears here. I shut my mouth and followed them. My gut, or maybe it was just the thousands of hours I'd spent staring at these ridges, told me something was wrong. The birds weren't singing in this sector. The wind whistled through the rocks in a way that sounded like a warning. 10 minutes later, when we entered the very blind spot I had been worried about, my intuition proved right. The first shot rang out from the cliffs above, shattering the mountain silence, and Jax screamed, ambush. Take cover. The world turned into a chaotic blur of gray smoke and screaming lead. I didn't even think. I just dived behind a jagged boulder, my heart slamming against my ribs so hard I thought it would crack a bone. The sound was deafening, amplified by the narrow walls of the crevice. I could hear the rhythmic thud of Jax's heavy rifle returning fire, but the enemy had the high ground. They were invisible, tucked away in the very shadows I had tried to warn the team about. I curled into a ball, clutching my tablet to my chest as if it were a shield. Dust and stone chips rained down on me as bullets chewed into the other side of my rock. I could hear the frantic shouts of the team over the roar of the gunfire. One of the guys, Miller, was down, clutching his leg and swearing through gritted teeth. Jax was barking orders, trying to coordinate a retreat, but we were boxed in. Every time someone tried to move toward the entrance of the canyon, a fresh hail of fire pushed them back. My breathing was coming in short, jagged gasps. I was terrified, paralyzed by the noise and the violence, but through the panic, a small part of my brain, the geospatial part, was still functioning. I looked at the screen of my tablet. The terrain wasn't just a map to me, it was a living thing. We have to move, Jax yelled, his voice sounding raw. He lunged toward my boulder, sliding into the dirt beside me. His face was covered in grime and a thin streak of blood. He looked at me, and for the first time, he didn't look annoyed. He looked desperate. Specialist, I need an exit. If we stay here, they're going to pick us off one by one. Where's the nearest cover that gets us out of this kill zone? I opened my mouth to answer, but my throat was a desert. The iron gate was back, tighter than ever. I stared at him, my lips trembling, but no sound came out. Jax grabbed my shoulder, his grip like a vice. Sara, look at me. Stop looking at the dirt and look at the map. Where do we go? His shout snapped. Something inside me. It wasn't bravery, not really. It was more like the frustration of being the only person with a flashlight in a dark room. I pointed to a spot on the screen, a narrow drainage pipe that wasn't marked as a path, but showed up as a thermal anomaly on my high-res scan. It was a natural tunnel carved by centuries of rainwater, hidden behind a cluster of scrub brush about 20 yards to our left. I tried to explain that it led to the other side of the ridge, but the words were still tangled. I just pointed and whispered, the tunnel. Under the brush. Jax looked where I was pointing. He didn't see anything but rock and dry leaves. He looked back at me, his eyes searching mine. Are you sure? I nodded, my head bobbing frantically. I knew that tunnel was there. I had seen the way the shadows fell across it in the drone footage 3 days ago. It was the only way out that didn't involve running across open ground. Jax didn't hesitate. He chose to trust the quiet girl he had mocked 10 minutes ago. He grabbed his radio and signaled the rest of the team to lay down a wall of suppressive fire. On his count, we were going to bolt for a patch of weeds that looked like nothing. On 3, he roared. When he hit 3, he grabbed the back of my tactical vest and practically hauled me out from behind the rock. We ran. The air around us was alive with the whistle of passing rounds. I felt like I was running through water, my legs heavy, my lungs burning. We hit the brush, and for a second, I thought I was wrong. I thought we were just hitting a wall of stone. But then, the ground dipped. The brush gave way to a narrow, dark opening that smelled of damp earth and old rot. We tumbled inside, one by one, sliding down a muddy slope into the belly of the mountain. The sound of the gunfire muffled instantly, replaced by the heavy, frantic breathing of 6 terrified soldiers. We were in the dark, cramped and shivering, but we were alive. Miller was being dragged in last, his face pale, but his eyes open. We sat there in the silence of the tunnel, the only light coming from the glowing screen of my tablet. Jax looked at me, then at the narrow tunnel ahead of us. He didn't say thank you. He just said, lead the way, specialist. You're the only one who knows where this goes. The tunnel was a claustrophobic nightmare. It was barely wide enough for a man in full tactical gear to crawl through, and the ceiling was so low that I had to keep my head tucked against my chest. The walls were slick with an oily condensation that made my hands slide every time I tried to push forward. I was leading the line, the glow of my tablet acting as the only lighthouse in this subterranean sea. Behind me, I could hear the rhythmic clink of gear and the heavy, labored breathing of the team. Every few seconds, a piece of loose shale would fall from the ceiling, making me jump and nearly drop the tablet. I felt a strange, terrifying pressure. For my entire career, I had been the one following the trail, the one hiding in the shadow of the person in front of me. Now, the roles were reversed. If I took a wrong turn, if I misread the geological layers on my screen, we'd be trapped in a dead end while the enemy circled around the ridge above. The iron gate in my throat felt like it was expanding, making it hard to swallow. My shyness usually made me want to shrink and disappear, but here, shrinking was a physical reality. I wanted to scream, to tell Jax that I couldn't do this, that I was just a girl who liked maps and quiet rooms. But when I looked back, I saw Miller's face, pale and sweaty in the dim light. He was relying on me to get him to a medic. Keep moving, Sara, Jax whispered from right behind my boots. His voice wasn't mocking anymore. It was steady, providing a sort of anchor for my spiraling thoughts. Don't overthink it. Just follow the line. I looked down at the screen. The thermal map showed a slight temperature increase up ahead, which usually meant an opening to the outside air. I crawled faster, my knees barking in pain against the jagged floor. The tunnel began to twist, turning into a spiral that made my head swim. I felt the urge to stop, to double-check the coordinates, but the space was too tight to even turn my head. Suddenly, the air changed. It went from the stagnant, metallic smell of the cave to the sharp, crisp scent of pine and rain. A few more yards, and the tunnel widened into a small cavern. At the far end, a jagged crack in the rock revealed a sliver of the gray afternoon sky. I scrambled toward it, pushing through a curtain of hanging moss and poked my head out. We were halfway up the western slope, hidden in a dense thicket of trees. Below us, the canyon where we had been ambushed was visible, shrouded in smoke. I could see the flashes of enemy muzzles as they continued to pepper our old position with lead, unaware that their prey had vanished into the earth. I pulled back into the cavern and looked at the team. They were exhausted, covered in mud and blood, but they were breathing. Jax crawled out last and stood up, stretching his massive frame as much as the low ceiling would allow. He looked out the crack at the enemy below, then turned to me. The silence in the cave was heavy. I waited for him to take over, to tell me to get in the back of the line again. I was ready to hand over the responsibility to become invisible once more. The radios are still dead, Jax said, tapping his headset. The mineral deposits in this ridge are jamming everything. We can't call for an extraction until we hit the high ground on the north side. That's 3 miles of contested territory, specialist. He paused, looking at the tablet in my hands. I can read a map, but I can't read the land like you do. Every trail out there is a potential trap. You stay on point. You find us a path that stays in the shadows. My heart did a somersault. He wanted me to keep leading? Out there? In the open? I felt the panic rising again, a cold wave that threatened to wash away my focus. I tried to protest, my hands flying out in a nervous gesture. I can't, I whispered, my voice trembling. I'm not a scout. I'm just an analyst. Jax stepped closer, his shadow looming over me. He didn't yell. He just looked me in the eye and said, an analyst is exactly what we need right now. Someone who sees what the rest of us miss. You saved us in that crevice because you weren't looking at the world like a soldier, you were looking at it like a puzzle. Keep solving it, Sara. That's an order. I looked at the silver screen of the tablet, then at the jagged horizon through the crack in the rock. The mountain was a giant, and I was just a speck on its skin. But for the first time in my life, I realized that being quiet didn't mean being empty. I had a map of the world inside my head, and for the next 3 miles, that map was the only thing that mattered. I took a deep breath, adjusted the strap of my equipment, and stepped out into the light. I didn't say anything, I couldn't find the words yet, but I started walking. The sunlight felt like a spotlight on my back, and every nerve in my body was screaming at me to run back into the darkness of the tunnel. Leading 5 battle-hardened soldiers through a forest that was crawling with people who wanted to kill us was not what I signed up for. I kept my eyes glued to the tablet, overlaying the live satellite terrain data with the vegetation density maps I had memorized. To the guys behind me, this was just a forest. To me, it was a complex web of sight lines and sound traps. I avoided the dry leaf patches and the open clearings, picking a route through the densest ferns where our silhouettes would be broken up by the foliage. Every time a twig snapped under someone's boot, I jumped, my heart skipping a beat. I wanted to turn around and tell them to be quiet, to remind them that we were practically walking through a giant ear. But the iron gate was still there, holding my tongue hostage. I just raised a hand, palm flat, signaling them to stop. It was a gesture I had seen 1,000 times in movies and training, but doing it for real felt like acting in a play where I hadn't learned the lines. Surprisingly, they stopped. Jax, the man who had mocked me hours ago, didn't question me. He just crouched down, his rifle swept toward the flank, waiting for my next move. I saw a flicker of movement on my screen, a thermal signature about 300 yards to the north, near the main trail. It was a patrol, at least 4 men, moving fast. If we had stayed on the path Jax originally wanted, we would have walked right into them. I felt a strange surge of adrenaline. My shyness usually made me feel powerless, but here, knowing something they didn't gave me a flicker of confidence. I pointed toward a rocky outcrop to our right, gesturing for them to follow me into a narrow ravine. It was a steep climb, and I could hear Miller groaning as he dragged his injured leg, but it was the only way to stay out of the patrol's line of sight. As we hunkered down in the shadows of the ravine, the patrol passed by so close I could hear the murmur of their voices and the metallic clink of their gear. We sat in total silence, the kind of silence I was used to, but this time it was shared. I looked at the team. They were watching the ridge above us, their faces tense. I realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one being observed and judged. I was the one doing the observing. My eyes were the ones keeping them safe. It was a heavy realization, one that made my hands shake, but it also made me feel solid, like I was finally clicking into place. Once the patrol was gone, Jax crawled up beside me. He smelled like gunpowder and sweat. He looked at the tablet, then at the path I had chosen. "Good call on the ravine," he whispered. His voice was low, meant only for me. "How did you see them coming?" I swallowed hard, trying to find my voice. I pointed to a small, pulsing dot on the screen. "Thermal, ghosting," I managed to say. My voice was small, but it didn't crack as much as usual. They leave a heat trail on the rocks for a few minutes. If you know what to look for, you can see where they've been and where they're going. Jax nodded slowly, a look of genuine curiosity on his face. I've spent 20 years in the dirt, and I never thought to look at the temperature of a rock. You see the world differently, don't you, Sara? I didn't know how to answer that. I just looked back at the screen. I wanted to tell him that I had to see the world differently because the normal world was too loud and too fast for me. I wanted to tell him that my shyness forced me to look for the details because I was too afraid to look at the big picture. But I just gave a small, quick nod and signaled that it was time to move again. We were nearing the extraction point, a high plateau where the radio interference would finally clear. But between us and the plateau was a wide-open meadow, a killing field with no cover for at least 200 yards. My tablet showed that the enemy had set up a heavy machine gun nest on the far side, perfectly positioned to mow down anything that tried to cross. There was no way around it. The ridge on either side was too steep to climb with an injured man. I felt the familiar panic returning, that cold, suffocating blanket that told me I had failed. I stared at the screen, my mind racing through every map layer I had. There had to be a gap. There had to be a secret the land hadn't told me yet. I stared at the screen until the pixels started to blur. The meadow was a death trap, a flat expanse of swaying grass that offered zero concealment. The machine gun nest was perched on a limestone ledge, giving the enemy a perfect 180-degree field of fire. I could see the thermal bloom of the weapon's cooling jacket. They were ready and waiting. My throat felt like it was being squeezed by an invisible hand. Jax looked at me, then at the open field, his jaw set in a hard line. He knew the math as well as I did. If we ran, we died. "We can't wait for dark," Jax whispered, checking his watch. "The enemy is closing in from behind. That patrol we dodged? They'll find our tracks soon. We have to cross now or we get squeezed." He looked at me, his eyes searching for a miracle. For a second, I felt like that little girl again, the one who would hide in the school library to avoid being picked for a team. I wanted to hand him the tablet and let him make the call. I wanted to be a follower again. But then I noticed something on the infrared overlay, a strange, jagged line of blue cutting across the yellow of the sun-warmed grass. I zoomed in, my heart skipping a beat. It wasn't a path, and it wasn't a shadow. It was a temperature difference. A subterranean stream ran beneath the meadow, and centuries of water had eroded a limestone sink or a shallow trench that was just deep enough to be hidden by the tall grass. It was a natural furrow, a wrinkle in the earth that didn't appear on any of the standard topographic maps. But the thermal sensor picked it up because the water underneath kept the soil 10 degrees cooler than the rest of the field. I tried to speak, but the iron gate was slammed shut. I pointed at the screen, my finger trembling. I looked at Jax, then at the field. I had to tell him. If I didn't, we were going to charge into a massacre. I took a deep breath, pushing against the weight in my chest. There's a fold, I managed to say. It was barely a whisper, but in the tense silence, it sounded like a shout. In the ground. Cool soil. It's a trench. We can crawl the whole way. Jax looked at the screen, then squinted at the meadow. From our height, you couldn't see it. The grass was too thick. Are you sure, Sara? If we get halfway out there and that fold disappears, we're fish in a barrel. I looked at the data. I looked at the blue line of the hidden stream. I thought about the thousands of hours I'd spent analyzing geological anomalies. I wasn't guessing. I was reading the mountain's diary. I'm sure, I said. My voice was small, but it was steady. It was the most certain I had ever been in my life. We dropped onto our bellies and started to crawl. It was agonizingly slow. The grass was dry and sharp, poking at my face and neck, and the dirt was cold and damp. Every time I moved, I felt like I was making enough noise to wake the dead. I led the way, following the blue line on my screen like a thread in a labyrinth. Behind me, I could hear the rhythmic rustle of the soldiers, the soft clinking of their gear, and the occasional muffled groan from Miller as he dragged his leg through the mud. Halfway across, the sound of the machine gun opened up. My heart stopped. The thud-thud-thud of the heavy rounds echoed across the plateau. I pressed my face into the dirt, smelling the rot and the earth, waiting for a bullet to find me. But the rounds were flying high, striking the trees behind us. They were reconnaissance. Fire, the enemy was shooting blindly into the woods, trying to flush us out. They didn't know we were right in front of them, tucked into a 6-inch depression in the earth. I kept crawling, my fingers digging into the cool soil. I felt a strange sense of calm. In this narrow, hidden world, my shyness didn't matter. The enemy couldn't see me, and my team was following me because they had no other choice. For the first time, being invisible was my greatest strength. We moved like a snake through the grass, inch by inch, until the ground began to rise again. We reached the base of the North Plateau, tucked safely under the dead space, directly beneath the enemy's ledge. They couldn't aim that low. We were safe. For now. Jax crawled up beside me, his face covered in mud, his eyes wide. With adrenaline. He looked up at the ledge, then back at the path we had just taken. He let out a short, breathless laugh and shook his head. "I'll be damned," he whispered. "A ghost road. You found a ghost road in the middle of a killing field." He reached out and gave my shoulder a firm, quick squeeze. I didn't pull away. I just looked at my tablet, the blue lines still glowing on the screen. We had 1 mile left to the extraction point, but the hardest part was behind us. Or so I thought. The final climb was the hardest. The North Plateau rose like a wall of jagged glass, and every muscle in my body was screaming for me to just lie down and let the mountain take me. My knees were raw, and my fingers were cramped from clutching the tablet, but I couldn't stop. The extraction point was a flat shelf of rock another 500 feet up. If we could get there, the radios would clear, and the transport could pick us up. But as we neared the top, my screen began to flicker. Not from a low battery, but from a massive localized signal, a jamming array. The enemy wasn't just waiting for us, they had set up a trap for the rescue team, too. If a helicopter tried to land here, the interference would scramble its navigation and make it a sitting duck for the portable missiles I could see tucked into the tree lean on my thermal scan. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The iron gate in my throat felt like it was made of solid lead. I had to tell Jax. I had to tell him that the safe zone was actually a kill zone for the very people coming to save us. I turned around, my face pale, my eyes wide. Jax was right behind me, helping Miller over a fallen log. He saw my expression and immediately leveled his rifle. "What is it?" "Snipers," he hissed. I shook my head, my hands flying out in a frantic, silent gesture. I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The shyness, the terror of being the bearer of bad news, the fear of Jax's reaction, it all came crashing down at once. I felt like I was drowning in the thin mountain air. Jax grabbed my arm, his face inches from mine. "Sara, talk to me. We're almost there. What do you see?" I pointed at the screen, at the red pulsing icons of the jamming array and the missile teams. It's a trap," I whispered. It was so quiet he almost missed it. "The extraction. They'll die. The birds. They'll fall." My voice was trembling so much it sounded like someone else was speaking. Jax swore under his breath, looking at the empty sky where we expected to hear the faint thump of rotors any minute. "We have to take out that jammer," Jax said, his voice grim. He looked at his team. They were spent. Miller was barely conscious, and the other two were down to their last magazines. "If we don't, the rescue mission becomes a suicide mission. But we don't have the numbers to storm that tree line." He looked at the terrain, then at me. I could see the gears turning in his head. He wasn't looking for a soldier this time. He was looking for a ghost. He asked me if there was a way to get close without being seen, a way to sabotage the array's power source. I looked at the maps. There was a narrow service crawl space beneath the rocky shelf, an old drainage tunnel from the mining days. It was tiny, even smaller than the one we had crawled through earlier. It was a space made for someone small, someone who could move without making a sound, someone who had spent their whole life trying not to be noticed. I can do it," I said. The words came out before I could think, before the iron gate could lock. My heart was racing so fast I thought it would burst, but for the first time, the fear of staying silent was greater than the fear of speaking. I wasn't just a map reader anymore. I was the only person who could fit in that hole. I was the only one who could save the pilots coming for us. Jax looked at me for a long time. There was no mockery in his eyes, only a deep, heavy respect. He handed me a small brick of C4 explosive with a remote detonator. "You don't have to be a hero, Sara," he said softly. "You just have to be yourself. Get in, set the charge on the generator, and get out. We'll provide the distraction." I took the explosive, its weight feeling like a ton of lead in my hand. I didn't nod, and I didn't say goodbye. I just turned toward the dark, narrow slit in the rocks and began to crawl. The crawl space was less of a tunnel and more of a crack in the mountain's ribcage. It was freezing, the air smelling of ancient, wet stone and the sharp, metallic tang of the jamming equipment humming somewhere above me. I moved like a shadow, sliding my body through the tightest spots, my skin scraping against the granite. For the first time, my habit of making myself small wasn't a curse, it was my superpower. I didn't breathe until I reached the end of the crevice, where a heavy iron grate looked up into the bottom of a portable generator housing. I could hear the enemy soldiers just a few feet away. They were laughing, confident in their trap, their heavy boots thudding on the rock above my head. My heart was a frantic drum, but my hands, the hands that had spent thousands of hours in the precision of the lab, didn't shake. I reached through the grate, my fingers finding the fuel lines and the cooling intake of the massive jammer. I tucked the C4 into the heart of the machine, the red light of the detonator blinking like a steady, tiny pulse. I didn't feel like the quiet girl anymore. I felt like the mountain itself, silent and inevitable. I backed out of the crawl space just as the distant, rhythmic thumping of the rescue helicopters began to vibrate through the ground. The enemy soldiers scrambled, readying their missiles. I didn't wait. I hit the trigger. The explosion wasn't just a sound. It was a pressure wave that slammed into my chest even deep inside the rock. Above me, the humming of the jammer stopped instantly, replaced by the roar of secondary fires and the panicked shouts of the enemy. The wall was down. The sky was open. Within seconds, The radios in my ear burst into life, a chaotic symphony of clear, crisp voices. Extraction 1. We have a clear signal. Moving to LZ now. I scrambled out of the rocks, breathless and covered in soot, just as the first transport helicopter crested the ridge. Its heavy machine guns opened up, suppressed fire raking the tree line where the missile teams had been hiding. I saw Jax and the rest of the team emerging from the brush, waving their signaling flares. Jax looked at me, his face lit by the orange glow of the burning generator, and he gave me a silent, sharp nod. It was better than a standing ovation. As we were hauled into the belly of the transport, the loud, chaotic energy of the rescue didn't overwhelm me for once. I sat on the vibrating floor, leaning my head back against the cold metal, watching the iron ridge shrink beneath us. Miller was being treated by a medic, and the other guys were shouting over the engine, their voices full of the frantic joy of survivors. Jax sat down across from me, his uniform torn and his face a mask of exhaustion. He didn't try to make me talk. He just reached out and handed me a spare headset. "You're a hell of a soldier, Sara," he said, his voice coming through the speakers loud and clear. "You don't say much, but when you do, you change the map." I looked at him and, for the first time, I didn't feel the heat in my neck or the gate in my throat. I didn't have to be loud to be seen. I had led them through the dark, through the fire, and through the earth itself. I just gave him a small, tired smile and adjusted my glasses. When we landed back at the base, the quiet girl didn't return to the shadows. I still don't like briefings, and I still prefer the silence of my maps, but now, when I walk into a room, I don't look at the floor. I know that every shadow has a story, silence has a frequency, and every quiet person has a world inside them that can move mountains. I'm Sara. I'm an analyst. And I've finally learned that you don't need a loud voice to lead the way, you just need to know exactly where you're going.